We also have a summer sale going on. If anyone's interested, most of our publications are half price, and they are on the table over there. They're marked. We also have t-shirts for $5 if you're interested in those. And another sale thing, we've got our Attic Treasures sale still set up in the basement. If you missed it, if you'd still be interested in going down and taking a look, that will be open after the program. Also on the table are surveys. We revamped, we added some new questions because we've had some interest in nighttime programs. So if you could give us a little bit of feedback, if you know anyone that has any speakers or anything like that, then that would be great information. Also, if you aren't already a member, consider becoming a member. We have a lot of great things for our members, like our newsletter, discounts in the gift shop, programs. So, and we're just fun people, so you should definitely be a member. Anyway, next is Kate. She is one of our board members. She's got like an encyclopedia brain. She's ridiculous when it comes to Cortland history, and she knows just about everything, and if she doesn't know it, she will figure it out. So she's a local history enthusiast, and I'd like to welcome Kate O'Connell. Thank you, Kate.
You're welcome. I will try to do this and not get too fast as I go through these slides. Some of you have been to my long program. So I'm trying, this will be a little shorter here. So we're going to start and talk about the Carriage and Wagon makers of 1890. It's a 92-94 map. Happens to be hanging on the wall in a wooden frame. It's one of our panoramics. And as I was looking at the map one day, I noticed, here's our panoramic. It's a little hard to see here. You can get an up-close look. And we do have one for sale if you'd like to purchase a copy of this. In the first two columns of the map, you can see that there are red stars. There are 7 listed carriage makers on this map, and the blue dots are 10 supporting industries, and that's just in the 2 columns. There's about 8 columns across the bottom with different businesses. So while our presentation will focus on the businesses of 92-94, the industry's been here for a long time. The first mention of a name in Courtland was Joseph Crandall in the spring of 1820. He had 2 shops on Port Watson Street near Maine. The first burned and the second went on to be Niver's Livery. There were other mentioned names of Wilbert and Collins and William K. Parker. So the first image, we're going to kind of go in order here down the line. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Cortland Wagon Company. This is located on the south side of East Court Street near the railroad tracks. And I will use this little bit of a cropped section of the map to give you an idea of where they're located. The yellow arrow is pointing to the Cortland Wagon Company. And I will use this same image for 5 of the next 6 wagon companies that I talk about. So our first gentleman, this is Lawrence Fitzgerald. He was born in Skaneateles in 1841 and began making wagons in shops there, Auburn, and Geneva, learning the trade. From 1862 to 65, he worked for S.W. Cately and Tully. He was briefly in Homer where he married his wife, and in 1866 he was located on a 1-story building on Port Watson Street. That's his bigger home. As he grew in his industry, he was able to build this house next to the 1890 house on Tompkins Street. In 1869, he formed a partnership with OCG to manufacture carriages and sleighs on West Court Street. This is probably behind the Wallace Building, where Bricks is today, and it was probably the home of the Palace Laundromat. So Charles Kinney bought out Mr. G in 1872, and soon after, Fitzgerald and Kinney began manufacturing platform spring wagons. With the increase in the demand, they erected a more extensive plant on Railroad Street, which today is Central Ave, where the high school and county office building is. In 1875, the name was changed to the Cortland Wagon Manufacturing Company. In 1876, they added an extra building on East Court Street near the railroad tracks. At this point, 2,200 platform spring wagons were built and sold in a year. In 1877, Mr. Kinney died, leaving Mr. Fitzgerald to run the plant by himself. Hugh Hugh Duffy, and this is his house at 80 Port Watson Street. The roof line has changed a bit, but the house is still there and the wraparound porch is gone. Mr. Duffy came to Courtland in the spring of 1875 with the Middletown Horseshoe Nail Company as an owner. As that company decided to move to another location, Mr. Duffy wanted to stay in the area. So on January 1st, 1879, the Cortland Wagon Company was incorporated with Fitzgerald as president and Duffy as vice president and superintendent. That year they made 6,000 wagons. By 1888, they were up to 8,000 wagons and working on a new complex on East Court Street. And a little side note, Mr. Duffy's son ended up marrying Mr. Fitzgerald's daughter. And they actually built the convent, St. Mary's Parish Center, with some of their money. So in 1881, everything was moved to the East Court Street location. This factory had a connection to both railroad lines, and today we call those lines the DL and W, and on the other end of the plant would have been the Lehigh line. And you can see the tracks running through the plant. And then, this is the cover of their 1889 catalog. And this is you can see the great conflagration of May 5th, 1888. The fire was discovered by a night watchman at 255 in the blacksmith shop. Lucian Hale pulled the fire alarm. He went across the street to the houses over here where a lot of the workers, the employees worked because Mr. Fitzgerald owned those, looking for help. The Emerald, Hitchcock, Orris, and Waterwitch companies all responded. And it is said that they poured 3,000 gallons of water per minute on the fire. By 6 a.m., the fire had swept away all but 2 of the buildings. And you can see the buildings here not burning. Investigators tried to figure out why the new $7,000 sprinkler system did not work. They came up with 2 ideas of the reason. First, either the heavy machinery on that crashed through the floor from the second floor blacksmith shop severed the water lines, or, being a new system, one of the volunteers that went to help fight the fire turned the valve in the wrong direction and shut the water flow off. This is the Waterwitch Company, which firehouse was on Main Street in Courtland, and they are proud of the fact that they were able to save the office sign. Within a year, a new brick complex was erected, and it contained nearly 7,000 acres of floor space. Fitzgerald installed over another $7,000 sprinkler system because he did not blame the company for the loss of his factory. In the upper left, you can see what was anticipated to be the complex. This is the back cover of that same catalog. And the complex didn't quite look like that when it was done. The blue arrow on the lower diagram of what the complex was shows the one building that is still currently there. This piece here still stands today. By 1899, the factory was producing 15,000 spring wagons and carriages, 5,000 carts, almost 8,000 cutters and sleighs. They had a branch in Brantford, Canada, that Mr. Duffy was the president of, and it produced 5,000 carriages and sleighs to avoid Canada's high import tariff. They had a branch in London where they could reach their customers more quickly, and they'd actually designed a couple coaches for the streets of London. Here's the inside of the plant from the 1899 grips. You can see all the wagons lined up. This is purported to be a wagon shop in Courtland. We don't know exactly which factory it worked out of, but look at the number of wheels and these gentlemen proud of their work. By the 1890s, they had introduced the Diana bicycles, and they were both built for men and women, and the Historical Society owns a woman's in their collection. By 1903, autos started to appear in town. Fitzgerald left the company by 1906 and moved to Auburn with his second wife. The Cortland Wagon Company appears in the 1910 city directory, but is gone by 1912. So obviously they're motorized vehicle did not take hold with the new president and board. And most of the buildings that you can see in these pictures were torn down in the 1970s. Our next company is the Hitchcock Wagon Company, and they're located on Elm Street on the east and west side of the DL&W railroad tracks. C.B. Hitchcock was born and died in 1840, and the family moved to Homer when he was 2. He attended school until he was 13. After working on a farm, he decided to learn the painting trade. He started out painting houses, then advanced to carriage paintings, and spent 2 to 3 years with S.W. Catley and Tully. He went to Cincinnati as a wagon painter. By the age of 21, he was able to purchase an interest in the shop of Larrabee and G. A year later, he was the sole proprietor. By the spring of 1877, he had disposed of this business in Cincinnati and began building cutters in the old G property. I'm not sure if it's the same man that he bought out in Cincinnati or not, on Port Watson Street. The Red Star, this is an 1855 map, but you can see 2 of these buildings here are both wagon shops on Port Watson Street. That year he built and sold 100 wagons. He purchased a church property on the corner of Elm and the railroad tracks and turned the church into a factory. In 1878, he turned out 250 cutters and 100 buggies. In 1879, 550 cutters and 200 buggies. This complex here is from the 1882 panoramic, and there's actually 2 versions of this. There was one with houses and businesses around the city of Courtland, which is hanging on the wall over there, and then he used it for himself to advertise his own sleighs and wagons. So in this he had a woodworking shop, a blacksmith shop, a painting and stock building, a 5-story building that housed a repository, trimming, and shipping, plus several smaller buildings. Now the red arrow is just to give you an idea of where the Cortland Wagon Company is. The blue arrow is the Hitchcock, and the green arrow way over in the back, there's a little tiny building. That's when Wickwires was one single building. It had just started, and they had just built that building new. May 30th, 1887, there was a boiler explosion. One end of the boiler was carried 275 feet to the mule shed. Part of it was driven back into the blacksmith shop. The middle section was found in the street, and a valve wheel was found all the way over on Vanette Street, which is like a block and a half away. There was an 80-foot chimney that collapsed, and it took down the adjacent wall. They lost over $1,000 in finished work, but also it left 3 dead and 2 injured. One of them was a fireman, and there were a couple workers.
Where was this, Kate?
This is the Hitchcock Wagon Company in 1887. The interesting thing is they said there would have been probably more fatalities and injured people working, but it was Decoration Day, so there were a lot of people off. And while the question was raised whether the boiler had been the condemned unit that was in the factory, it was not. It was the largest of the 3 and furnished steam to the whole plant. This is inside their blacksmith shop. By 1888, you can see this is the 1888 city map and complex. The left image shows the Hitchcock, they had a foundry on Port Watson Street, and the right image shows they had several different buildings. They had this complex here, they had these buildings here, and they had this whole piece over here. The big wind of September 1888 took down this storage building, and you can see there's a pair of cutters that can be seen in the middle there. And I believe this building ran perpendicular to Central, to Clinton Street, because I think these 2 houses are still there. They're the first 2 houses after the parking lot. In 1890, 25,000 vehicles were built. He employed 425 men and he had a weekly payroll of $4,500. You can see some of his products. He also made farm implements with the foundry, and he had a gentleman that made and patented traps for the Courtland Trap Company, and we have two of them here in our museum, and I'll leave those out so you can see them later. The Hitchcock Hose Company was formed in 1888 in the building to the west of the tracks to protect the Carriage Company, and many of the men were employees of the Wagon Works. Billy, the black horse seen there, was a gift from Mrs. Hitchcock. The second building was constructed in 1905 farther down the street and was in operation until 1915, until they went to a central fire station. Today it's known as the Palm Gardens. The Panic of 1893 swept the nation, bringing widespread unemployment, wage cuts, and strikes. By the summer of 1893, none of Hitchcock's machinery was operating, with only finishers and painters completing inventory. He was looking for a way to diversify and had already added bicycles. In the fall of 1894, Hitchcock signed a contract with the Motorcycle Company of Cleveland, Ohio. The inventor, D.J. Pennington, was going to move his headquarters to Courtland and expand to eventually construct 100,000 machines a year. The factory's top floor was converted into the world's largest indoor test track, where 5 laps equaled a mile. In March of 1895, the Cortland Standard was reporting that there were rumors that the cycles were not going to be made here in town. By July, the company was in receivership. Mr. Pennington had quietly left town, owing money to the bank, the hotel, and the tailor. Turns out that he was a professional swindler. It took until 1900 to get him arrested in New York City to settle his local debts. And his story makes for an interesting read, and you can see part of it in Chronicles 2. There's a story on Hitchcock and Pennington's interesting history. This is an image of the complex about 1899. It still says, so it's about 1890 to 1899. It gives you an idea of, they had that line that crossed the street to connect the two buildings, and I'm not sure what they moved across it, whether it was coal or rail line or what they did. In 1896, Samuel Cater purchased the real estate belonging to Hitchcock Manufacturing Company at auction from the receivers. He held liens on nearly all of it. The entire property sold for $500, subject to the liens of $66,000. Cater and Wells was formed with Mr. Harrison Wells, who was also trying to protect his investment. But business conditions in the wagon and carriage industries were getting worse. In the last days, they produced a few very special vehicles. And I just want to point out the red star on that image over there on the right. That building still exists, and that's the Roundhouse Mill on Elm Street. This is the popcorn machine, and it's located at the Shelburne Museum in Vermont. And that is in Chronicles 3. There's a whole article on the history of the popcorn machine. By 1900, Wallace Wallpaper was in the large 5-story brick building on the east side of the railroad tracks. The foundry on Port Watson Street operated for a few years as Cater and Wells, and by 1916 it was just Mr. Cater involved, and that business was sold in 1918. And this is what the plant looked like about the 1940s. And notice that there's 5, we complain about 1 row of train tracks and cars crossing the street. There were 4 rows of railroad lines. Just as an interesting side note, I found a very bad Polaroid in the files here. And last week, I took a hunch and went and said, wonder if that is still there. And as I was able to go into a business, and this safe is still in use today. It is gorgeous, and it's about 5 foot by 5 foot. It's enormous.
That's where Page changed, that's it.
Well, it's at the mill. They still, I assume, I don't know how it ended up in that thing, because when Cater and Wells had the building, they used it as storage. So I'm not sure how it went from the plant into a storage building, but it is still there on part of what was originally the land. So our next company is the Cortland Manufacturing Company, and this is located at 16 Squire Street. And it is actually located near, today you can still see the back of the turnaround down Owego Street, the brick curved building. If you ever wondered what it was a railroad turnaround for cars. So this plant sat next to it. Many of you might know it as Champion Sheet Metal was in that area. In 1833, the Cortland Standard article states that one of Cortland's youngest yet most thriving industries is run by Mr. R.C. Tillinghast in the Buggy and Cutter Factory located on 16 Squire Street. It was started in 1881 and consisted of a wooden 3-story building with smaller buildings for blacksmith, gear shop, paint shop, and storage rooms. By September of 1885, he was unable to secure an extension on his notes. In 1886, the Cortland Manufacturing Company Limited incorporated on the spot with a capital of $30,000 from Mr. Hubbard and Mr. Berry. They devoted their entire energies to the manufacture of fine carriages, rad wagons, buggies, phaetons, surreys, cabriolets, and what they considered their celebrated triple buckboard, which is the advertisement here. And I can't tell you what most of those types of wagons are. Sorry to say. And by 1896, the business has failed. You can see the receiverships, the sale of property, closing out the remnants of the factory. Now we have the Cortland Omnibus and Cab Company. This is located on the corner of Pendleton and Railroad Streets, Central Ave. This happens to be a map of Albany Street in Homer, and you can see the R. Smith Wagon Shop over there. This company is the successor of the W.T. Smith and Company of Homer. He was the son of R. Smith. He started working for his father as a carriage builder in 1850, and in 1867 went to work for himself. Around 1876, he built his first omnibus for the Dexter House in Cortland. That brought in several orders. He was soon compelled to abandon the carriage business and devote his attention to the manufacture of just omnibuses. He is credited with building the first light omnibus in the country. In December of 1881, Smith formed a partnership with the Cortland Wagon Company under the title the Cortland Omnibus Company. In March of 1882, a stock company was formed, and that took control of the works, with Mr. Smith as the superintendent. The original structure consisted of 2 buildings perpendicular to each other. In 1887, ground was broken on this complex shown here. The main structure measured 120 feet on Railroad Street and 150 feet on Pendleton. And this is what omnibuses look like in large wagons. This happens to be the Bath's omnibus, and if you look close at the top writing, it's the Courtland House. In January of 1896, the personal property of the Cortland Omnibus and Cab Company was auctioned off by the sheriff. The National Bank of Cortland purchased it for $5,250. It was sold to Mr. W. Ellis for his son E. E. Ellis. Mr. E. Eugene Ellis had started working for the company in 1892 as president and treasurer. After the purchase in 1896, the name was changed to the Ellis Omnibus Company. And his house on the right there can still be seen at 96 North Main Street. It's painted, I think, yellow with green trim. This company built the first open and closed streetcars used in the Cortland and Homer Traction Company. Their work could be found in almost every state. They also shipped large cabriolets, omnibuses, and modern transfer coaches to different parts of Mexico and Bermuda. It was still operating in 1910, and the building was purchased by Brockway in 1912. Our next industry is the Cortland Cart and Carriage and the Cortland Buggy Works, number 9 and 10 here. So this building is located on 41 Port Watson Street, about across from where Church Street hits Port Watson, before the section of Church Street with the island in the middle of it. You can see the street did not continue through into Randall Flats at the time. Today, like the Republican headquarters is there, which was originally, that was the Cortland Bottling Company. The Cortland Cart and Carriage Company, in June of 1888, a partnership was formed between Messrs. Malberg, a Swedish immigrant, Louis Hatfield, and M.K. Harris for the manufacture of a new style of road wagon patented by Mr. Malberg. The partnership went under the name the Cortland Buggy Company. The wagon was exhibited at a number of fairs in the vicinity and at the Buffalo Exposition. It was very well received. In 1889, with a capital stock of $10,000, the company was formed under the name the Cortland Cart and Carriage Company, with Mr. Harris opting out. They rented the second and third floor of the brick A&M Skirmerhorn building on Port Watson Street and the whole of a 3-story wooden structure in the rear. A bridge connected the second floor of the two buildings, and at the rear of the brick building there was a large elevator. By October of 1889, by the October of 1889, they had purchased out the business of Mr. Skirmerhorn, and in 1894, L.I. Hatfield was president and treasurer, Mr. Wheeler was vice president, and on the board of directors was Ira Hatfield, Mr. Malberg, and Mr. Burdick. The Cortland Democrat states that the company was producing some of the finest work in the country, including their celebrated buggies, surreys, business wagons, end spring buggies, Excelsiors, novelty springs, dandy wagons, coil spring carts, and cutters. They employed 100 skilled workmen. On March 11, 1895, a fire began in the wooden building and spread to the brick building as well as the neighboring structures. The firm recorded a loss of $45,000, of which only $25,000 was insured. Their early statement in the paper was that they would reopen soon. By July 19th of 1895, the company had accepted an offer from the village of Sydney, New York. They would be relocating to a sash and blind factory building there. They also took 50 employees with them. Newark Valley had also tried to encourage the business to come to their area. By the early teens, Louis Hatfield was in charge of this, with a Sydney resident, Mr. Sherwood, as vice president. The Hatfield Light Express was produced between 1912 and 1913. They produced several models between 1917 and 1931, but with the ill-timed introduction of the Hatfield 6, the company filed bankruptcy in May of 1924. The Cortland Buggy Company. According to Grips in 1899, the Cortland Buggy Company is engaged in the wholesale manufacture of wagons, carriages, and sleighs at 16 and 19 Duane Street. Joseph H. Talmadge is said to have been at 19 Port Watson Street for 9 years previous, until a fire of February 1900 forced him to move. It was also mentioned that he'd been in business for 12 years before that at 2729 Port Watson Street. From this, I get very confused, and I haven't been able to trace quite this company because I can't find the beginning of it. I don't know when it started, when the earliest mention of it is. Except that Cortland Buggy is also mentioned with the Cortland Cart and Carriage, and I don't know if these companies overlapped. I do know, though, that Mr. Talmadge had a number of legal issues for fraud. He was arrested in 1896, 1902, and he was sent to jail in 1906. And his wife had filed a few complaints against him as well for fraud. Now, on another note of this company, there was a buggy company called Talmadge Cart and Buggy Company. And from what I can find, J.H. Talmadge started this business in 1886. And his location in the 1887 directory was at 47 Port Watson Street. So was that the Courtland Buggy Company? I don't know. In 1889, the directory has moved to 5458 Railroad Street, which is the location that Fitzgerald built where the high school is today. And he was in business with Mr. J.G. Reed. By December of 1889, Mr. Seymour and Mr. Nelson had bought out the business, and it was gone by 1890. And we know the school was built in 1892 on that site. Next is the H.M. Whitney Company. And this is located on East Court Street and Pendleton Street on the west side of the railroad tracks. This was first organized in Homer in December of 1882 under the name the Homer Wagon Company Limited. Its first president was George W. Phillips, and A.W. Hobart was the secretary-treasurer. In the fall of 1887, the business moved to Courtland, locating at the old shops on Railroad Street, the high school. In the fall of 1888, ground was broken on East Court Street. In December of 1888, I think that's that image. That shouldn't have been that. There we go. On December of 1888, a new factory was up and running. Yes, 3 short months it took to build that large building. The main building, made up of 3 sides of a square, is entirely of brick. It is 3 stories tall and it has 3 towers. One was an elevator and the other 2 were water towers. It was equipped with automatic sprinklers, electric fire alarms, a time clock, and a watchman's clock. The cost was $65,000 to build, and they had a switch track that attached them to the DL&W Railroad. The name was changed in January 4th, 1892 to the H.M. Whitney Company. At that time, E.S. Burroughs came on as secretary-treasurer. In 1897, the name was changed again to the H.M. Whitney Company. A little background on Henry Morton Whitney. He was born in Moravia in 1851. On leaving school, he had selected law as a profession. His father died only months into his study, and as the sole support for his mother and younger siblings, he decided to learn a trade. He moved to Tully and entered the employ of S.W. Cately for about 3 years. He left the wagon industry in 1871 and went to work in Syracuse for the Elias Howe Sewing Machine Company. He came to Homer in 1881, and after a year on the road as a carriage salesman, he helped organize the Homer Wagon Company. That's the inside of his plant in the 1899 grips. And this is his beautiful, I'll leave this out too for you to look at. This is his catalog, and it's the most beautiful cover that I have seen on any of them. Most of them are just paper catalogs. As of September 1900, the company is gone. I could find no information on its last days, and the Historical Society doesn't even have a folder on this business. The complex was purchased in 1903 by the J.E. Davis Company for a piano business, and it burned on April 5th of 1912. They made piano cases and backs, not the pianos themselves. So during this program, you'll notice that I mentioned Mr. S.W. Cately several times. Hitchcock, Fitzgerald, and Whitney all trained under Shepherd W. Cately in Tully. Mr. Cately was born in Preble in 1815, and after teaching in Cortland and Onondaga County, he tried the law. until ill health forced him to give it up. He went into the wagon-making shop of his brother-in-law, John Dennison, in Brookfield in Oneida County, under the firm name of Dennison and Cately, around 1837. The shop was moved to Tully in 1848, and because Mr. Cately thought it would be good to be close to the coming railroad. He secured a large order during the Civil War by traveling to Washington, D.C. himself. In 1876, he came to Courtland as a salesman for Fitzgerald and Kinney. Advancing years and poor health forced him off the road. It was at that time he perfected and patented 11 different inventions for vehicle attachments. In company with his daughter, Mrs. Alice Etling, he turned his attention to getting his inventions into general use. And if you look at the grip, these are grips images. If you look at the image on the right, Mr. Cately is in the buggy. Mrs. Etling is sitting on the porch of the house, and that's her son with the bicycle.
Where?
This is
Next to the front sidewalk.
91, I think 91 Lincoln Ave. And this house is still there. At one time, they also lived at 26 Lincoln because that house was built by Mr. Fitzgerald. So, the business was known as Cately Carriage Attachments. Mrs. Etling was the sole lady exhibitor for over 10 years at the annual convention of the Carriage Builders National Associations. Mr. Cately died in 1898 and is buried in Tully with his 2 wives. And we have some of, if you look at the image over on the right, his family was generous enough to donate many of the plaques and things, printing stamps that were used in their industry. We also have the images from the grips. We have all the printing plates from them. And the last slide here that I want to show you is some interesting facts that were compiled in the Cortland Standard in 1889. You can see the name of the industry, what they made, and who worked for them. So like the Homer Wagon Company that was located in Cortland had 60 male employees. Cortland Omnibus at the time had 40. Cortland Wagon Company employed 400 men and 4 females. Hitchcock at the time was employing 400 men and 6 females, and they also had 50 men working at the foundry on Port Watson Street. So this just gives you some other pieces of information, the associated businesses, Excelsior Top Company, the Cortland Top and Rail. Cortland Harness is the precursor to Brewer Tichenor. They were all in business. Homer had Brockways, and they employed 200 men. And an interesting thing here, I've been talking to Mary earlier on Monarch, and I had another lady bring, this is Bean and Anderson that had 15 men working, and she happened to bring, she has a thermometer with the advertising for the Bean and Anderson Wagon Company.
Wonderful.
Any questions that I might be able to help with or answer?
Is Bean and Anderson family to the person who brought that in?
Yes. Me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Kate, when you had numbers of, like cutters and sleighs and all that were manufactured, did any of the years line up so that you could say that 40,000 were made by all the companies at a certain year?
I didn't quite get into that, and the interesting thing is if you read different articles at the same time, the numbers changed greatly from one year to the other. One might list it as 25,000 here, but when they give the diagram within their catalog, it might have 15,000 more. So I'm not, it's hard to say what they're, yes, what were the real numbers? I don't know.
They were sold internationally. Did they ever say how many went overseas? I mean, they had to be going on a ship or something, so.
But if you notice, most of those businesses early on were all located near the railroad, one way or another. And Fitzgerald prided himself that he positioned his plant to have access to both railroad lines. Because the interesting thing that I thought of, when they made those train lines come through Courtland, they intersected across. There are no switches that you could easily get from the Lehigh to the DLW.
Is there any feedback to the Cortland Historical Society that these wagons have been found in Ohio or Iowa or Indiana or Colorado or California?
If you go through the folders for each wagon company, there have been inquiries from different people that purchased them all over the country. I was at a sale, I bought a cutter, is this made here?
Okay.
In most of the folders for all the different wagon companies. I just found it interesting that the Whitney has no folder. And it only showed up in a few times, and that one article, where was it? I thought this was interesting. If you read it, every bit of material has been worked up, even the last bolt, and every room cleaned out, even the cobwebs. But they were advertising in 01 and 02, they wanted a treasurer with capital. Like, were they still holding out hope that they could salvage and start working again or something? I'm not sure.
But it's pretty much Wagons and Works made Courtland pre-Brockway trucks and the others. This was a wagon company town,
And even Homer was. There were probably 4 or 5 operating. I mean, that's what Brockway started out making, was wagons. And not many industries transitioned well. One of the other few that really transitioned well was brewers. They started out making harness parts, and they ended up being able to transition into making auto parts.
Is there any way of researching in what other paperwork is available, remotely speaking, when it tells how many people were employed in any one business? That's the only stat that we can get. Not that they were blacksmiths or wheel makers or painters.
That's not the article.
Because I know it would.
You would have to go through every piece of newspaper you could get your hands on.
When
and
you
see
look
what
at a
could do.
directory and it says where you work and what you do for a living, sometimes it'll just say plain wagon maker, or does it have the business name?
Sometimes.
Just wagon maker. Oh, okay.
McGraw has a sleigh that showed up one Halloween. It was never claimed. We advertised and advertised because it was a lovely, lovely sleigh. And it's in storage at the highway garage, and they bring it down, put it on the library front porch. There's nothing to identify it, but it looks very much like one that we have a picture of in one of the books. It was a really pretty sleigh. I'm surprised somebody didn't claim it. Who knows where it came from?
There was a Surrey for sale on the Little York Crossing last weekend. I don't know if it was purchased. It was said to have been in a barn and the roof fell on it so that the top of it is damaged, but the bottom of it certainly was intact. It was for sale on Friday, and Saturday he finished, and I haven't had a chance to ask him if somebody locally bought it and kept it. It just needs the top repaired, and other than that, it was in perfect condition. And it does have the Fitzgerald president, vice president, and treasurer's name on a plate on the back of it, which is, from the Cortland Wagon Company.
Yes.
Are there any books that on any of these individual businesses that are more in depth, like ledgers or anything like that?
I don't know about these. I mean, I know we've got a lot of the whipwire ledgers. I don't think we have ledgers from other businesses.
Fitzgerald or...
Hard to tell unless you started.
When you mentioned the name Reeve at one point, I gave the Historical
Reed.
Society.
Reed.
Oh, Reed. R-E-E-V-E.
This is R-E-A-D.
Okay. They made ironing boards and sleeves.
So I just thought this was kind of fun
That's
to.
beautiful.
The image we have, I have to print these off and put them in the file. You couldn't even see the logo in the center because they used at the time the camera they used had a flash, and it flashed out the image.
Do they use that?
It's used, yeah.
As storage or as...
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's in the office, and he said I told him who I was, what I was doing, and I had the rough copy as I had printed it off my computer and said, "Is this still here?" And he kind of looked around the corner and he goes, "Right there."
It'd be interesting, you could do a thing just on safes, because like the Fiorentini safe is...
Well, Jones's is still, that was a bank.
B.T. Jones's is still available, and
Yeah.
it's because it was a
Well,
bank.
it was before the
Right.
fire. I don't know if it's still there, but
The Fiorentini one, they had to completely
support the floor under it.
support the floor, and it's pretty much unmovable.
Well, that's because, and that jewelry store has always been a jewelry store,
Mhm.
so.
I mean, it looks about the same size, I don't know how tall.
This is about 5 by 5.
Oh.
It's up on a platform and it stands up here above me.
Yeah.
The doors are heavy, and I was amazed that it's actually double doored.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then there's.
You go to the
safe
first
with-
set, and then you have to open the second set of doors to get into the safe.
Mhm.
I wonder if the Hitchcock family, the Zoggs, know that there's that safe there.
The gentleman at the mill did say that he's talked to them, and they've shared different things
Oh,
back and
uh-huh.
forth.
Yeah.
Do you suppose there might be one available in the Cortland Bottling Works building, still intact?
I don't know. I didn't hear about a safe being in there when the Perfettis owned it, so I don't know. One of the wagon company, the Cortland Cart and Carriage thing that I didn't share before that I thought was interesting. One of the men was able to get to part of the building before the whole complex burned, and he cleaned out the safe. The one thing he forgot was on the desk was the $25,000 worth of orders that had already been taken, and the order book burned. He was able to save all the bills and all the other paperwork they had, but the order book of things that people wanted to buy was gone.
Thank you, Kate.
That was very interesting.